Welcome to Binging Bridgerton, a podcast series going episode by episode through Netflix's new favorite romance series. I'm Beth, and my co-host is Amrita, and today we are joined once again by our favorite person on Twitter, Sal. Welcome, Sal.
Thank you so much for having me back.
Yay! So excited. For those who are not following Bollywood chat on Twitter, this is how Sal and Amrita and I all know each other, and it is just such a treat to bring this conversation into a new topic that is, not unrelated. Episode 6, I feel like when I look at my notes for what there is to talk about, there's so much happening in this, so everyone should leap in as they feel anything is being forgotten, because, man, there is a lot to cover. I want to start with Colin's announcement of his engagement. Colin is now engaged to Marina, and as soon as the family finds out about it, it is not going to go well, and Anthony and Colin have a bit of a spat, with Colin delightfully saying, well, I didn't tell you because I knew you would act exactly like this.
And Anthony saying things like, I knew this was my fault. I should have just taken you to a brothel. And I was just like, what?
I mean, he's not wrong about that based on what we see of the other men in this show.
But also, what a wonderful thing for, like, a brother to say to another brother when the brother's like, oh, I'm going to get married. Couldn't you just do with a whore instead? Like, what?
Every time you start giving Anthony the benefit of doubt or, feeling a little bit sympathetic for him, he says something like extremely head ass and like, and it's immediately so alienates your sympathies. And I think Colin is so naive. Every time Colin says or does anything, my reaction is like, poor dear, and I think this was one of those moments. But you do sort of feel for the sincerity of his, emotions, because this is a show, or this is a time period where, the characters sort of pride themselves on their archness and their flippancy and the fact that they're not particularly invested in feeling things. And Colin's, bred in the bone, sort of romantic. And I felt for him. I felt for the fact that this was this person having, experiencing the first flush of love, or what he thinks is love, and really going with that. And there's a sort of nobility to that I responded to, even though it's all extremely spectacularly wrong-minded and naive.
Colin is definitely the best Bridgerton, right?
He's definitely the sweetest Bridgerton.
At this point, he's my favorite for sure, because Eloise continues to be annoying, unfortunately, so that kind of leaves me with Colin.
The only people who are super happy about the Colin and Marina engagement are the Featheringtons, or all the Featheringtons except for Penelope, of course, who is desperately trying to stop it without outing Marina and in the process destroying her own family's reputation. And Marina is full steam ahead, and when she realizes that Penelope is in love with Colin, she's not evil about it. She's not, I've heard people say that Marina's being a total bitch to Penelope, but honestly, I feel like Marina's just very facts of the matter. So she's just look, Colin doesn't love you. I'm sorry, but that's true. And he is in love with me, and I am going to make the best decision I can for myself and my child. And if that hurts you, I'm sorry, but it's not like you had a genuine chance anyway.
I think what's horrible about that exchange is simply that Marina says, I'm a woman and you're a girl. I feel like I've been on the receiving end of that before, and it's really, really hurtful in a way that's different from that guy doesn't love you and I'm getting to leave and go do something you want to do. It's an extra twist of the knife. But otherwise, I agree. I think she does exactly what she needs to do.
And also, throughout this episode, for the first time, a lot of the subtext becomes text because it's verbalized by Penelope, and she starts saying things like, don't patronize me and don't mock me. And she She exhibits an overt understanding of the fact that Marina is more conventionally attractive than she is, and she can understand that that's what drew Colin towards her rather than any maturity as such. And all throughout the thing, like she is genuinely concerned for Colin, like in everything that Marina and Lady Featherington have cooked up together. They have decided, this is the best course of action for everybody except Colin. Like nobody's thinking about Colin except for Penelope. And I felt so bad for her because she genuinely tries to help Colin, and she goes up to him and she explains that Marina is actually in love with somebody else. And of course, Colin is an idiot because he's a total Bridgerton.
I do love that Penelope tries this option before doing what we know that she does that we won't be spoilery about, but she's being as careful, I think, as she's able to be because she is still a little bit young and naive, although not in some ways. But, Sal, what do you think about Marina and Penelope's relationship?
Marina is just so compelling to me as a character.
Yeah.
Because she's this almost like Scarlett O'Hara-esque, survivor.
Ooh.
She's that person. And in contrast to these other women for whom the stakes look different. And, Daphne, who's choosing between a prince and a duke and things like that. This is a woman who's really, she's been, sort of dropped off at the house of, an uncaring, unfeeling relative who's taken her on because of, financial reasons. And, she thinks she's been jilted in love. She's pregnant. She's desperate. But she's someone who keeps trying to make things work for herself with what she has. And what she has is her wiles and her beauty. And she's so compelling to me. And I think there's that moment where, Lady Featherington sort of sees her as, the kind of girl who'd more naturally be her daughter, someone who's a fighter. And, at this point, we don't know about Pen some things that we find out later. But at the same time, like Marina being that kind of person who's like, this is what I have to do because this is the lot of women right now. And this is the best I can do with the cards that I've been dealt. Just is so compelling to me that I go with her on that journey, like I'm willing to follow her, even though the things she's doing are callous and hurtful and, they aren't necessarily morally right or any of that. But, seeing that character be also inhabited by like a black woman, like a young black woman, in this world, is so compelling to me, for her to be the heroine with the highest stakes plotline in a way, is sort of moving to me. So I'm like really willing to follow her even when she's doing things that are questionable.
Absolutely. I love that she calls the modiste out on, I know you're not French. It's one of my favorite moments of the entire series. And then, although somehow we're supposed to believe that all these also upper class educated women don't know enough French to follow that conversation, I call total BS on that. And I also love that then Lady Featherington looks at her like, game recognized game, all right. It's pretty, like an alternate series where Lady Featherington and Marina are on the same side would be pretty fantastic.
I think also as someone obsessed with fashion, I love that the biggest power moves on the show happen at the modiste's salon.
Oh yeah, you're so right.
Like, it's just so satisfying to watch, like, Daphne take down Cressida and then, Marina have that conversation and these moments again and again. They're so satisfying. And they also do this thing where, I think we've been conditioned to think of clothes and fashion and all of that as frippery and frivolous and anything that's, the predominantly a feminine interest is sort of frivolous and extraneous and all of that. But to see that space as the space where these women are really making power moves and flexing is very satisfying.
You're absolutely right. And we see later when there's a man in that space who's not supposed to be there, how much he has to hide because he knows that's not his, that's not the, yeah, the power rests elsewhere in that space. Oh, what a good point. This is the episode that really people are talking about when they're talking how much sex there is in this series. Simon and Daphne all over the estate, indoors, outdoors, upstairs, downstairs, in any way you want to interpret that.
Yeah. So much sex. And you actually had like a good point where you were asking like, what about the foreplay?
It's just instantaneous, and I don't find that as romantic, I have to say. And I don't know if the point of that is to be romantic or if the point is something else. But, you know, if they would slow down a little bit, I think they would have a lot fewer problems in a lot of ways. It kind of also feeds into the what Daphne doesn't know world that is so uncomfortable that this is how sex is presented.
This is something that I think Romancelandia has begun to discuss over the past few years, which is that sex in a romance novel, and particularly in a historical romance novel with its emphasis on virginity and the sexual experience lying on the men, it really does lean very hard into this idea that, you know, as soon as a man and a woman touch each other, and I'm saying man and a woman because the romance of queer people in historical romance it's very much a new thing. Like, it's only over the past few years that we've really seen that. So the bulk of historical romance that is being published even today is really heterosexual. And it really does rest upon this idea that you have this very shy virginal person and this really experienced man. And then as soon as the two of them touch, she immediately wants it and she is immediately ready for sex. And then the orgasm happens in like 2 pages. It leads to a lot of ideas being perpetrated in popular fiction and in the popular imagination about what sex should be like for women. That is honestly rather harmful, whether you're a virgin or not. If you're very young and you've never had sex, then you think, well, that is what sex is supposed to be. And if you're older and you've had sex and you read a lot of these books, then you wonder, well, if this is what it's like for so many people and, you know, being written by so many different women, then is there something wrong with me that's not how I'm reacting? Like, what is happening? So I wasn't a big fan of that factor. But I think what the series is doing here is that it is, because, you know, when you're writing a book, you can just be like, you know, Simon and Daphne couldn't keep their hands off each other. And for the next 7 days, they were just making love all over the place, you know, and then we can just move on to like maybe 1 or 2 specific examples of them making love and like spend time building that up. But in the series, when you're translating that into visuals, you want to just really cut down on the time. And so what you see rather is just the two of them just laying hands on each other and like immediately having an orgasm within like 30 seconds. And it's not just unrealistic, but also like Beth said, you know, like what happened to the foreplay? Because sometimes the foreplay is the best part of sex, whether you're watching it or you're experiencing it. But having said that, I do want to say that the perspective, like the gaze of the camera, is always on Daphne, and it's on her experience of pleasure. And the only time that we really look at Simon is when he's pulling out, because that's his preferred method of birth control, which, I'm sorry, Simon, but like, that's not really great. But Simon is just like spending all his time like pulling out, and Daphne is just very confused, and she thinks it might have something to do with the fact that he's unable to have children, but she's too delicate to ask. But there's a lot of things happening with that whole like Simon and Daphne shagging all over the estate part of the narrative.
Yeah, first of all, I want to say Simon is spending all of his time pulling out might be my favorite sentence of 2021 so far. Like, it is such a fabulous sentence out of context. But also, I think it's so, there's I feel like the scenes are choreographed fairly well. You can tell that there was like, an intimacy coordinator and things like that. And, women on set, especially because despite the lack of foreplay, despite them just getting into it and then being done in like 3.5 minutes. And I'm like, okay, she's 19, she doesn't know better, but I will say that the sex looks hot.
Oh, yeah.
Which is not always the case with like, very cis heteronormative sex on TV or in movies, I think it does look hot and that's a win, but there's also such a humor to it. The fact that, he has all of this land. He basically has, an entire like the entire north side of Chicago, like that much land to basically, shag all over. And then these servants are sort of spying on them or like, sort of putting their ears to the door. And I remember my roommate and I were watching and, she was like, that's so, they're just around. They're like doing it in front of the servants. And I'm like, well, to them, the servants are like appliances. So it's like, it's for them, it's the equivalent of us doing it in front of like the washing machine or the, things like that, like the dishwasher, because other than Daphne with her lady's maid, they don't particularly treat the working class, the servants, like as people as much. We get a little bit of that, like in the interactions, especially in Daphne's interactions with people in the village. But otherwise, it's very like, oh, that's the coffee maker, and that's
which doesn't quite add up, given that what we've seen the servants can help them do in earlier episodes when they go out to destroy Burbrook. They know that the servants hear things. They know that the servants talk because they've employed those networks themselves. It's a little inconsistent, but I know you're quite right about, how they don't see servants as people, even when they're in the dining room 10 feet away.
Well, but Daphne knows that, and Daphne's the one who points out to Simon that there are people in the room, but Simon has no idea. Simon honestly does see them as appliances, as Sal says, like he doesn't notice anything about them. And one of the great things is like when Simon is like flirting with Daphne and he's pretty much about to have sex with her on the dining room table. And you can see the footmen exchanging glances and being like, what is happening? That's really great. But going back to what Sal was saying, the class differences and the way that we are seeing it being woven into the narrative across all these episodes, and particularly in this one where, it's almost as if the housekeeper in this one episode has more of a sense of what is required of the two of them as the Duke and Duchess than the two of them do. And you see both Simon and Daphne over the course of this episode come to an understanding that, oh, life isn't just fun and games and like, living in your own little fantasy world. It's responsibility. And it's interesting to me that the people that remind them or inform them of their responsibilities and the correct way to go about things are actually people from the lower orders, so to speak.
Yeah. So once Daphne gets the knowledge from her lady's maid Rose, who is definitely one of the best tertiary characters in this series, she takes that knowledge and uses it in an extremely upsetting way. I have not read a lot of the conversation around this scene. I gather there are people who think Daphne is justified. I think Daphne has assaulted her husband and non-consensually trying to have a child with him, which is creepy beyond belief, because despite what this show seems to say, it's actually fine not to want children. But Daphne is supposed to be morally correct here, I think, and it's pretty upsetting to me. What do you both think?
What I take issue with is the fact that the show doesn't seem to know that it was assault.
Right.
Because it's treated in such a cavalier and offhand way in terms of the filmmaking. We don't really dwell on Simon's, horror or anything of that sort in any substantive way. I think it's a breach of, it's seen as a breach of trust, but the show doesn't quite reckon with it being even bigger than that, it's not just, sort of an everyday kind of like trespass on someone's trust or things like that. It's a fairly severe thing. So when I was watching it, I was like, and then, once I was done and I, sort of read a little bit about it, I was like, yeah, why didn't my mind stick on it a little bit more? As, a member of, an audience in the 21st century watching this happen, I should have known better. And I think part of that is because the show itself doesn't know how to reckon with it. I think for them, it's this moment of shock and awe, and Daphne kind of, asserting her agency and things like that. And also, it's supposed to be sexy kind of in a way because, she's straddling him and, she's being the aggressor and all of these things, but the consent is not there. So, it isn't sexy. It's really horrifying when you really think about it. And then, of course, it goes back to the fact that Daphne has received no sexual education. No one's talked to her about any of these things. We're visiting a world through the show where, one brother is telling his younger brother that I should have taken you to be around sex workers so you wouldn't need to, sort of marry the first woman you fall in love with, things like that, So I think it is a different world, but I think it also, as a sex educator, it really drives home the point that sex education is important no matter what century you're living in. And the fact that Daphne didn't receive any of it and is really working off of scraps that, people are dropping around her, culminates in this really kind of horrible moment on the show.
When she gets a scrap of information, she uses it so aggressively is just so, I don't have the right word for it, but Amrita, you had said something like, because Daphne's a Bridgerton and therefore the worst, she does the worst thing. And I don't disagree.
I mean, I have so many thoughts about this. I mean, just going back to what Sal was saying about sex education, okay, so in the book, the scene is even worse, if you can believe it. Because in the book, what happens is Simon and Daphne have a big blow up fight and he gets drunk and then he comes back home and he's blackout drunk and she takes advantage of him in that situation.
Oh no.
Which is just like straight up rape at that point. And in this one, I think they try to sort of manage the situation because, again, this is the first book in the series, so it was published about 20 years ago. And I've seen Julia Quinn, the author, try and make a case about like how when the book was first published, people were more upset about what Simon had said and, in that he had lied to her as compared to what Daphne had said. And in the 20 years since, the culture has shifted and now everyone's upset about what Daphne did versus Simon. And I mean, 20 years ago, we didn't have social media the way that we did. So I don't know what she's basing that off. Like, were people writing to her and being like, excuse me, madam, but I'm really upset about Simon? I don't know where that's coming from. Because as far as I know, like, as long as we have been discussing Bridgerton in Romancelandia on social media, everyone has always understood that what Daphne did was wrong in the books. And when the series was announced, that was one of the number one things that people were discussing is how are they going to handle that scene? That's literally how we refer to it in Romancelandia, like that scene. Everyone knows that scene because it's horrible. So that's one thing. The other thing is like in the show, like Sal says, like the storytelling makes a difference, in that the series makes a decision where it's going to focus its attention, and therefore because it just sort of slips things off and sort of tries to reframe this conversation around Simon lying or whatever, we are encouraged to sort of move right along past it because they knew it's indefensible as it was written. And I feel like Regé Jean, because he is such a good actor, he does his best in that scene because you can see that the stutter comes back. And like nobody else apart from his father and Lady Danbury really know that he stutters. Like Daphne's never heard him stutter, but he's so upset in that moment. You can see him stutter. And the series does, make him say things like, oh, I thought you knew how babies are made, which is a total lie. I mean, this is a girl to whom you had to explain the concept of masturbation and like, the logistics of it. He was like, literally like, what do you do with your hand and in which part of your body? She literally didn't know that much. And then all of a sudden he's like, well, I told you I won't have children and I thought you knew what that meant. She literally thought that him jerking off into a handkerchief would hurt his dick. Like, this isn't a woman who knows anything about sex. So he's clearly lying in that moment, and he's just trying to make himself feel better about the things that she's saying to him. And it's really clear that she's upset, but what was really awful to me about not just that particular scene, but also the one earlier in his study where they have sex on his desk. What's really upsetting to me about both of those is that, again, the gaze of the camera is on Daphne, and Daphne is clearly not having sex for the pleasure of it. And up till then, you've seen Daphne be really enthusiastic in their sexual encounters. And in these two last sexual encounters, Daphne is clearly thinking, and she is being intentional, and she is being calculating in a way that is rather distressing, because for the first time, the camera then focuses on Simon having an orgasm, and he is clearly panicking while he's doing it. And it's just, these are just really distressing choices in the series, in my opinion.
I think there's one more kind of major plot point we haven't talked about, which is that, speaking of people who take a scrap of information and go nuclear, Lady Whistledown reveals that Marina is not only with child, she has been the whole time that she's been in London. And we'll fall to later episodes to see what happens with that, but there's great narration by Lady Whistledown about, do the ends ever justify the means?
And of course, this comes right before, or right as Marina and Colin are on their way to Gretna Green.
Yes.
Because again, Marina has managed to manipulate Colin into wanting to run away with her instead of waiting for even a special license.
Anything else about episode 6 that we would like to discuss?
Closing thoughts, like for me, I think this episode really reminds you that the lead female characters are teenagers. I think, I don't know, I don't know if it was Beth or Amrita who said, going for the nuclear option. It's very that energy of like, Regina George tearing out that page from the burn book and distributing it all over, high school, except with higher stakes. But those are the stakes for the women in this world. For them, it's like, I have this information. I'm like running on pure rage and hormones, and I'm going to do what I can to get what I want, which is a very, a 17, 18, 19-year-old girl thing to do, thinking back to who I was at that age. And it's so interesting to watch how that plays out in a world where the stakes are so much higher and lives can be ruined for good, as it seems like Marina's will be, at this point, at least in the show, like at the end of episode 6. And Simon and Daphne's marriage is sort of in tatters at the end of this episode. So I think the fact that teenagers are being put in positions where they can make these decisions is terrifying.
I mean, as literature teaches us throughout history, and actual history does too, don't put teenagers in charge of anything. Amrita, any more closing thoughts from you?
Well, I'm glad at the end of this particular episode, when everything else is in tatters, Eloise and Penelope have found their way to each other again.
Oh, yes. That is very sweet. When you go back and you know what you know, you can see that Penelope's distress comes at a very particular timing in the events. And you see her dealing with the sadness and guilt and probably several other emotions as well. And it feels again like a very honest moment as a human, not just as a teenager, but as a human, to be able to collapse into the arms of someone who loves you no matter what you've done is a great gift.
I also really enjoyed the part of the Modiste where Marina and Lady Featherington run into Violet, and Eloise, and Lady Featherington says, "Isn't it wonderful that we'll be related?" Or like we'll be like close, we'll be at close quarters for the rest of our lives. And Violet looks like she's just been slapped in the face with a fish. And she's just like, "Yes, isn't it wonderful?"
Let me ask a question about the Featheringtons, because their full financial collapse has not happened yet. So what is it about the Featheringtons that everybody's a little bit like, ugh? Are they just gauche, or is there something else happening
They're
there?
like new money and they're supposed to be tacky. Even though when I looked at all of those fabrics, I was like, I would wear each and every one of those dresses as like a sari. Like that would, like those gorgeous yellow, like embroidered brocades. I was like, I would wear that. That would look amazing. But you see how that contrast is set up also, because you have Daphne, who's like, the jewel amongst the debutantes, who exclusively wears like pale grays and icy blues. And then you have these girls like, peacocked all the way up. So there are those visual cues to delineate how they're different from the rest of the ton.
And there's a wonderful moment where Marina is talking with not Penelope, but her sisters. And Marina's also in a dark red at that point. So she's temporarily joined the flamey Featheringtons before other things happen. So it is always worth noting how well costume design is used in shows like this to code who is who and what we're supposed to think about them.
Right.
I think that's probably it for episode 6. Thank you both so much for talking through this doozy of an episode with me. Sal, tell people where they can find you online.
You can find me on Twitter at Sal and the Bad Pun. That's Sal and the Bad Pun. And I hope you'll come listen to me rant about all sorts of things.
Everyone should. Amrita, where can they find you?
You can find me on Twitter at AmritaIQ or on YouTube at Amrita by the Book. And I also co-host a Bollywood podcast called Khandan.
And I'm Beth Loves Bolly at Twitter, and you'll see us 3 talking about this show and many more things. Thank you all for joining us.